Did you know the woman behind one of the most expensive fashion brands on earth learned to sew because she was an abandoned orphan, not because she ever dreamed of being a designer? Nuns taught her, in a cold convent orphanage, purely so she could support herself one day doing basic, practical labor. Nobody in that room imagined they were training the founder of one of the most valuable fashion houses in history. Here's where it gets even stranger. In 1954, at 70 years old, that same woman tried to relaunch her fashion house after a 15-year absence, and French critics tore her apart for it. They called her comeback collection outdated, tired, a relic from another era. Within a few years, that outdated collection was being copied by department stores across 2 continents, and the woman behind it was being credited with permanently changing the way women dress, forever. This is the story of Gabrielle Coco Chanel. And her beginning has almost nothing in common with the woman the world remembers. Part 1, Abandoned at 12. Gabrielle Chanel was born on August 19, 1883, in Saumur, France, to an unmarried laundrywoman and a traveling street vendor who sold undergarments from town to town. Her birth certificate misspelled her own last name. That's how little formal record even existed of her family's place in the world. Her early childhood was spent moving constantly across the French countryside, following her father's work. Then, when Gabrielle was around 11 or 12 years old, her mother died, worn down by poverty and illness. Her father made a decision that would define the rest of Gabrielle's life. He sent his 2 sons off to work as farm labourers, and handed his 3 daughters over to a convent-run orphanage in a town called Aubazine, and simply didn't come back. Life at Aubazine was strict, frugal, and disciplined. But it was there, among the nuns of the Congregation of the Sacred Heart of Mary, that Gabrielle learned to sew, a practical skill taught to orphan girls so they could eventually support themselves. Nobody in that orphanage was training a future icon. They were simply preparing an abandoned child for a modest working life. At 18, aged out of the orphanage, Gabrielle earned a spot at a boarding school in Moulins run by another Catholic order, where she continued working as a seamstress. It was here, moonlighting as a cabaret singer in the evenings, that she picked up the stage name that would follow her for the rest of her life, Coco. Part 2, From Mistress to Milliner. In the early 1900s, Coco became involved with a wealthy former cavalry officer named Aubazine, and moved into his estate. It was a life of horses, high society, and leisure that a laundrywoman's daughter was never supposed to access. But Coco wasn't content simply being someone's companion. While living at Aubazine estate, she started making hats, not as a business at first, just as something to do, something that was hers. That changed when she met Arthur Boy Capel, a wealthy English businessman who would become the most significant relationship of her early adult life. Capel saw something in Coco's hat-making that Aubazine never had, actual commercial potential, and in 1910, he financed her first shop in Paris. 3 years later, he backed a second boutique in the resort town of Defied, where Coco began selling simple, comfortable clothing alongside her hats. This is where the foundation of everything Chanel would become started to take shape. Coco had grown up in poverty, wearing practical, unadorned clothing out of necessity, not choice. Now, she took that same plain, functional aesthetic and began offering it to wealthy women who'd spent their entire lives suffocating in corsets and heavy, restrictive fabric. She used jersey, a fabric previously reserved for men's underwear, to make clothing that let women actually move. It was, in the most literal sense, a poor girl's practical wardrobe being sold back to the rich as liberation. Part 3, Building an Empire on Simplicity. Word spread quickly. By the years following the First World War, Coco Chanel wasn't just running a boutique, she was redefining what fashionable women were willing to wear. She introduced the now iconic little black dress, stripped down and unfussy at a time when women's fashion was still built around ornamentation. She paired it with costume jewelry, another idea that scandalized traditionalists who believed only real gemstones belonged on a wealthy woman. In 1921, she released what would become the best-selling perfume in history, Chanel No. 5. It broke from convention immediately. Rather than smelling like a single flower, as perfumes traditionally did, it was a complex blend of dozens of ingredients, designed to smell abstract, modern, and entirely unlike anything else on the market. Her interlocking double C logo, which would eventually become one of the most recognized symbols in the world, traced its design straight back to the stained glass windows of the orphanage where she'd once learned to sew as an abandoned child. Even her famous quilted handbag design carried echoes of that convent past, the chain strap inspired by the caretaker's chatelaines, the burgundy lining borrowed from the convent uniforms she'd worn for years. By the 1920s, the woman who'd once had nothing had built a fashion house wealthy enough to count European aristocracy, American socialites, and Hollywood among her clientele. She'd even had a long affair with the Duke of Westminster, one of the richest men in England. When people asked why she never married him and became a duchess, she reportedly replied that there had been several duchesses of Westminster, but there was only one Chanel. Part 4, The War Years. In 1939, with the outbreak of World War II, Chanel closed her fashion house entirely and laid off thousands of employees, keeping only her perfume business running. During the German occupation of France, she lived at the Hotel Ritz in Paris and began a relationship with a German officer named Hans Gunther von Dinklage. This period of her life remains the most heavily scrutinized. In 1943, Chanel traveled to Madrid alongside Dinklage and a British aristocrat friend, in an operation that German intelligence had organized in hopes of using Chanel's social connections to open informal peace talks with figures close to Winston Churchill. The plan collapsed when her companion alerted British authorities. Historians still debate how much of this was calculated collaboration versus an improvised, self-interested attempt to protect her own position as Germany's fortunes turned in the war. What isn't in dispute is what happened right after Paris was liberated. French authorities arrested Chanel as part of the broader post-war purge of suspected collaborators. She was released without formal charges, and shortly afterward, she left France for Switzerland, where she remained largely out of the public eye for close to a decade. Part 5, The Comeback Nobody Wanted. By 1954, Chanel was 70 years old, largely written off by an industry that had moved on without her. She made the decision to relaunch her fashion house anyway, and the initial reception was brutal. French critics dismissed her new collection as tired and out of step with the times. But something unexpected happened across the Atlantic. American buyers and press responded to her comeback collection with genuine enthusiasm, particularly to a structured, collarless tweed jacket paired with a matching skirt, the piece that would become known as the Chanel suit. It offered exactly what Chanel had always sold: comfort, simplicity, and quiet confidence, at a moment when American women were newly entering the workforce in large numbers and needed clothing that let them move through their day without being restricted by it. Department stores began copying the silhouette almost immediately. Rather than object, Chanel treated the copying as validation, proof that she'd once again identified something women actually needed, not just something critics thought looked interesting on a runway. Here's the thread running through this entire story, from the orphanage in Aubazine to the fashion house that still carries her name today. Coco Chanel didn't succeed by designing what fashion insiders considered beautiful. She succeeded by designing what she herself had needed her entire life: practical, unrestricted clothing, born out of genuine poverty, not artistic theory. The little black dress, the tweed suit, even the flat, low-slung quilted bag, every signature Chanel design was, in some form, a version of the plain, functional clothing an abandoned orphan had worn simply because nothing else was available to her. She spent her career selling comfort to women who had never once been forced to live without it, and somehow, that's exactly what made her designs feel revolutionary to them. Her personal history includes real, well-documented complexity, including choices during wartime that still generate serious historical debate to this day. But the fashion empire she built from nothing has outlasted every controversy attached to her name, and it still shapes how people around the world get dressed every single morning. That's the story of an abandoned orphan who turned the plainest clothes she owned into one of the most valuable fashion empires on earth. If you want more stories like this, founders, obsessions, and the empires nobody tells you the full truth about, subscribe to the Business Archive, because next time, we're going inside the story of two brothers who built rival empires and never spoke to each other again. See you in the next one.